I think in terms of the context for reform, I don't mean to dwell on this too much. I mean, we all know that the CAA was abolished back in the summer. We then had in August the abolition of the Audit Commission itself. And alongside that, the wider dynamics which have affected government generally around mistrust or distrust of government, both at the, well, essentially the national level, but that permeates down to the local level as well. And obviously the significant budget cuts we're facing. But when we looked at this topic back in September, those three pictures were kind of what the debate was about, you know, the attacks on the Audit Commission for having a string quartet at their conference, for spending money at the horse races and for spending too much on office chairs. And we kind of thought the debate needed to be lifted a number of levels above that. And it'll be interesting to see, with ministers speaking to CLG today, how that goes. But I think as well as that broad context around audit reform, I think we need to be aware of what's going on elsewhere. And one of the things is there's been a House of Lords inquiry into market concentration in audit services. And I think this is something we have to have in the back of our mind when we reflect on what the new market could look like. And as you can see, significant concentration up to the left-hand side of that graph. And the real fear is around what might happen if one of those bigger tier firms was to drop out. Alongside that, as Chaz already mentioned, is the issue about the banking crisis, which introduced significant concerns around what kind of assurance should be expected from the auditors and from other types of assurance providers. And we need to bear that in mind in terms of designing the new audit for local government. And I think we mentioned the issue about it being a bit of a crossroads, and I think we're very pleased. We had a bit of a blank canvas here on which to sketch out our ideas. So we believe that there were sort of three principal foundations of local government audit, and these relate to the independence of the auditor, and I'll sketch these out in a bit more detail. The provision, the availability of that audit and at the right cost and quality, and also the issue of local choice. And when you look at these in a bit more detail, I suppose the specific things that relate to government and local government are the issues about the fact that it's public money, and that is slightly different from private money, so there's a different interaction needed between the citizen or the shareholder and government versus a private company. There's also the very big issue about what happens when an auditor finds something wrong, and in a way there's no point having an audit process if you can't report when something goes wrong. And we need to make sure that there are very robust systems in place to ensure that that's handled properly. In terms of localism, well, we know that this government is, it wears its localism on its sleeve, as it were, but it's also, not only in rhetoric, but also in its actual policy, very localist. I suppose, for our point of view, we were interested not only in where we are now at this juncture, but also where we're going to be, 5 years down the line, perhaps 10 years. And there's a big shift at the moment towards local financial autonomy. That happened partly through the budget cuts. It's happening also through the government's local government finance review. It's happening in terms of how councils raise their own capital. So there's a really big shift here where a lot of councils will be raising the majority of their money themselves. So instead of looking up to the centre to give you some plaudits or otherwise for how you spend it, there's a reference point down to local citizens. And I think the government is really driven to get that accountability between citizens and government, and it wants the audit process to re-emphasise that rather than undermine it. And the third key element of provision, well, under the Audit Commission model, not only was auditors appointed centrally, but also they were procured or provided centrally. And the market concentration potentially, which I set out earlier in that graph, is obviously a potential danger to the local government audit market as well. And I think it's also worth reflecting on, in these times of austerity, what type of audit do we actually want? There's an issue about the cost of that audit as well. But these were the foundations on which we went to look at the principal questions. And that's encapsulated in our research questions. But I think it's worth pointing out that actually a lot of these dynamics, the localism, the independence, the vibrant audit market, don't always coincide. And at times they might actually conflict. And I think the reason why we moved to a centralised appointment process was because that does give you absolute clarity of independence. But at the same time, it's impossible to have a free market in provision. And it does also undermine the democratic connection between citizens and local democracy. So marrying these tensions is a very difficult task, and I suppose what we found to be, through the research analysis, very problematic. So what are some of the challenges that we face? Well, I think the first thing is around, in speaking to those in local government, speaking to professional bodies and accountants, there are key issues about ensuring that trust in local democracy and making sure that any system we design has that at its heart. I think people also referred, I suppose, to some of the failures in corporate audit, and obviously Enron does always get mentioned and was mentioned, and there are dangers about how you design the system so that it makes sure that an auditor isn't also doing other work which may compromise its integrity. But there's also the issue about public interest reports. Public interest reports are the negative reports that an auditor will write if the authority is misappropriating funds or treating funds in an inappropriate way. At the moment, with an independent audit commission, it's relatively easy for that appointment process to be maintained. But the issue is if you totally devolve it, and if I'm a chief executive and someone says something they don't like about my authority, then whichever process you establish in that authority, I have a vested interest to try and make sure that auditor, or damning auditor, doesn't come back and damn my books again. So there's an issue about how we tally that together. The other issue which we came across significantly was, and I'll go on to speak about this in a little more depth in a moment, the type of audit that's done. If you look at the responses to the evaluation of the CAA, which came out about a year ago, there was some concern about the use of resources, the fact that some central body was prescribing what good practice should look like in terms of actually carrying out your audit process. And I think that's been added to by the severe cost reductions we've got in at the moment, and we need to reflect seriously on how we reduce costs. And I think finally this issue about the audit market, that there's a clear message from the sector that there are concerns about what type of provision is going to be available for them, how competitive is it, what sort of costs are they going to be looking at, and what sort of quality. So very briefly, I'll just refer to three other elements that we looked at, as well as our sort of research into the sector. The first was thinking historically, and I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that since the Poor Law back in the 1830s, we've had basically an ongoing centralisation process. And especially in the 1860s and the 1970s, there was a move to move appointments away from the authority itself. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind. How far do we want to go back? We might want to go back to a situation where we didn't have the Audit Commission, but do we want to go back to the 1830s? I think there's an issue also about where this sort of a decentralised model has been rolled out in other sectors in this country. There's been lots of talk going on in the CLG inquiry about the foundation trust sector, which has a decentralised model. And some of the comments around there has been the fact that there haven't been many, if any, public interest reports coming out. There have also been concerns about the costs of audit. So I think the lesson there is that whatever system you put in place, you have to make sure you mitigate against those sorts of problems. And I think when you look to other countries, there are a number of interesting instances. We had a very decentralised model introduced in Victoria, Australia, which went pretty horribly wrong. But on the other hand, we had some much more positive instances of decentralisation going on in countries like the Czech Republic. And again, I think the message is there. If you can establish some system for appointment which isn't connected to the local authority itself, then there may well be ways to square the circle. So, in terms of appointment, what NLGN proposes is trying to hand a significant degree of authority outside of the council itself. And we believe that the people who should hold that responsibility are citizens themselves. So our key recommendations are that we set up a local audit committee on which we would have a significant, a majority of non-council members to ensure impartiality. And I think a significant element of that is also to make sure that all of these documents and meetings are done in public, so that if there is an issue about compromise, that citizens themselves can hold the local authority to account. And this essentially just sets out the process. The citizen appeal here is sort of an additional check we thought was needed following an appointment of the process, if an auditor does issue a damning report, quite rightly in that instance, then the committee decides not to reappoint, then actually that should be open to appeal from citizens who may actually want some decent level of scrutiny of their local authority. In terms of the spectrum of audit and to what depth we try and audit local authorities and local bodies. I think the first point is that not only does the Audit Commission cover upper tier and lower tier, well, district authorities, but also, I think, thousands of other local public bodies. And there's a big issue about what kind of validation do we need of their accounts. And essentially, local authorities were up here a relatively intense audit process, and private companies in here, and many charities are down here, and we're advocating for both cost purposes, but also to open up the market to other providers, that we shift this back and that we move authorities to the point where actually they need much more of a check on their financial viability as an authority rather than on the process they go through to achieve that. And so we're recommending the reduction of the compulsory level of audit. And as I'm sure Ian will go on to speak a bit about, we have some recommendations also about shared services. In terms of the population of audit, i.e. what bodies should be audited, I think in the big society we're in the danger, under the current model, of auditing everyone to death. I mean, in the future we may well see parish councils taking on additional responsibilities, we may see community groups take on additional responsibilities. And what we need is a method for checking that that £1,000, that £50,000 is spent appropriately and measuring that in a proportionate way, rather than going through the sort of the full value for money audit which we do in councils at the moment. So we've got significant recommendations for reducing the thresholds for smaller public bodies. The final comments I've got really are about the audit market. This is the local government audit market, and as you can see, the Audit Commission provides the significant majority of it themselves. I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that in 1983, when the Commission was established, I think they had 13 providers who, external providers who provided about 15% of the market. We're now in a situation where we have 5 providers who provide about 30%. So we have, we have a bit of a danger of market concentration, but we also have an element of market concentration already. And it's crucial, therefore, that to reduce costs in the future and to make sure we have market quality in the audit services, that we address that future danger. And we have a number of recommendations, but I think the key one is around the Audit Commission practice. Again, this has been raised in the House of Lords inquiry recently, and if the Audit Commission practice was rolled out in mutual, it would make up about 10% of audit throughout the country. So it's a very significant player, and we believe that would make it a much more competitive market. I think the other point is more specific about procurement guidelines, and I'm not sure what the government doesn't generally like guidance, but we do feel that in a transition period, in any case, that we need to make sure that authorities don't put too much weight on existing experience, but look instead at expertise, quality and capability. And I think some of the lessons we drew out from the Foundation Trust model demonstrate some of the potential dangers there. So in terms of how we achieve our objectives, I've just set those out in this diagram here, and I suppose at the heart of it all sits this independent audit committee, which can achieve all of the aims that we want to achieve. And I suppose the final point really is around, I think this government doesn't like regulation. I mean, no one particularly likes regulation, but I don't believe we're actually deregulating, we're just re-regulating the market. And actually what we're doing is putting burdens on different players in the market, and those are set out there, but obviously citizens themselves have to take a lot of that responsibility themselves. And I suppose finally, armchair auditors is always the discussion that comes up. We're asking quite a lot, I think, of citizens, but I believe that this is in tune with the way that the government perceives public services to be moving, and that if we move in this direction, we will reconnect local government and its citizens. Thank you very much.